Something about last night didn't feel like politics anymore. It felt like the moment a system realizes it has run out of ordinary options, and the only tools left are the ones designed for emergencies no one ever wants to use. By sunrise, the conversation in Washington wasn't about legislative priorities or the next campaign fight. It wasn't even about impeachment. It was about the clause everyone quotes in whispers and rarely in daylight. The 25th Amendment, Section 4, the incapacity provision. The premise is chilling because it forces the country to ask a question it hates asking. What happens if the president is alive, awake, speaking, posting, ordering, and still not capable of carrying out the duties of the job? In this account, the trigger wasn't a single scandal or one stray comment. It was a pattern that over weeks began to look less like a strategy and more like an unraveling. And last night, that pattern allegedly accelerated into something that even allies could not explain away as just Trump being Trump. What follows is a reconstructed narrative based on public behavior, reported concerns, and the kind of frantic back-channel chatter that tends to spill out when people inside government think they're watching a slow-motion emergency. Treat it for what it is: a depiction of a system under strain and the frightening mechanics that exist for the moment when persuasion stops working. The night the temperature changed. In the version of events being discussed, the president's overnight activity wasn't merely aggressive. It was scattered, ranging from attacks on foreign partners to bizarre claims that contradicted basic reality. Posts appeared, vanished, reappeared in altered form. Targets changed mid-thought. Grievances multiplied without a consistent thread. People who have tracked Trump's communication style for years often describe his late-night bursts as rage, vengeance, or deliberate provocation. This account describes something else: disorientation, confusion, a kind of narrative drift where words seem chosen for impact rather than meaning, and meaning collapses the longer the message goes on. What made it different, as some observers frame it, wasn't that he was angry. It was that he appeared untethered, issuing commands that didn't map cleanly onto real authority, describing meetings that allegedly didn't happen, and invoking people and events in ways that didn't align with time or fact. By morning, the phrase spreading through staff circles and cable chatter wasn't a campaign slogan. It was a constitutional citation. Section 4. Why? Section 4 is different from impeachment. Impeachment is political accountability for misconduct. It is an accusation, a trial, a vote. It is slow by design, public by nature, and driven by Congress. Section 4 of the 25th Amendment is something else. It exists for incapacity, when the concern is not what a president did, but whether the president can function. It is also one of the few constitutional mechanisms that can move fast. Under Section 4, the Vice President and a majority of the Cabinet can transmit a written declaration to congressional leaders stating that the President is unable to discharge the powers and duties of the office. The effect is immediate. The Vice President becomes acting President. But it is not a clean ending. It is a struggle mechanism. The President can respond with a written declaration saying, essentially, "I'm fine." If that happens, power can revert unless the Vice President and Cabinet double down within a tight deadline. Then, Congress is pulled into a high-threshold vote requiring a two-thirds majority in both chambers to sustain the transfer. It's a system built to be both usable and hard. Usable in an emergency, hard to abuse. And because it has never fully been used this way in modern times, everyone who contemplates it is stepping into the unknown, the build-up. Why one night wouldn't be enough. A single bizarre night doesn't automatically equal incapacity. Even presidents who are stable can have terrible nights. Anger, insomnia, medication side effects, stress. That's why the narrative that Section 4 is even being discussed relies on accumulation, not a one-off, but a sequence that has become harder to dismiss. In this telling, there were earlier moments that set the stage. Speeches where the president wandered far from prepared remarks, claims that didn't hold up, digressions that left audiences uneasy, and public appearances where pauses and confusion became noticeable enough that even political allies struggled to smooth it over. The most alarming interpretation is not that the president misspoke, it's that his grasp on continuity weakened, jumping between unrelated claims, looping back to old obsessions, blending jokes with policy, and treating online outrage as if it were operational command. When that kind of pattern emerges, insiders begin to do what they always do. They start asking each other the question that cannot be asked openly without detonating careers. Is he okay? What may have set off the latest spiral? The narrative you provided points to a convergence of pressures. Three stressors hitting at once. 1. Economic strain. If a core economic policy is producing instability instead of the promised boom, the political cost is immediate. Presidents can absorb many critiques, but sustained economic pain cuts deep, especially when it is linked to signature decisions. 2. Internal loyalty fractures. In any administration under stress, the vice president becomes a focal point for people who want continuity without chaos. Even the rumor of quiet meetings, cabinet members testing the temperature, donors checking alternatives, can trigger paranoia in a president who already sees betrayal everywhere. 3. Humiliation. A synchronized wave of ridicule, especially about mental sharpness, can function as a psychological accelerant. Trump has always treated mockery as a threat. If the mockery targets competence rather than ideology, it strikes at identity. In this telling, the spiral begins with private rage, thrown devices, staff rushing to manage the damage, and then becomes public through the medium Trump uses as both weapon and comfort. The phone screen, the posts begin. But unlike earlier outbursts, they do not lock onto one enemy. The target shifts, the claims lurch, the tone oscillates from bullying certainty to strange confusion. And that's when the conversation in Washington turns from "this is ugly" to "this might be dangerous." Why this becomes a national security issue, not just a health discussion. The most frightening part of an incapacity scenario isn't the embarrassment, it's the chain of command. In a crisis, presidents make decisions quickly. They consult advisors, but the authority rests in one person. That includes decisions with irreversible consequences. Military posture, escalation, strike authorization, emergency orders, commands that move institutions. If insiders genuinely believe a president is behaving irrationally, the threat is not a bad post at 2 a.m. The threat is a bad order at 2 a.m. That's why, in this narrative, the defense establishment becomes central. Senior military leaders are trained to follow lawful orders and refuse unlawful ones. But lawful does not always equal wise, and a lawful order delivered under impaired judgment can still produce catastrophe. So in an incapacity discussion, the question becomes brutally concrete. Do we trust this person to hold the nuclear decision-making authority at 3 equals in the morning? If the answer becomes, "I'm not sure," the system is already in crisis because uncertainty itself is destabilizing. And adversaries, as intelligence officials often warn, study instability. They watch patterns. They look for openings. If a president's behavior becomes predictably erratic at certain hours, that predictability becomes exploitable. The vice president's dilemma, the key that can't be duplicated, Section 4, lives and dies with one person, the vice president. Without the vice president, cabinet signatures do nothing, and that creates the deepest political trap in this entire scenario. If the vice president moves, he is not merely disagreeing with the president, he is declaring the president unable. He is triggering the most severe internal action possible. If he moves and succeeds, he becomes acting president and potentially the person who removed a leader beloved by a passionate base. History may call it courage. Supporters may call it treason. If he moves and fails, he is finished. The president returns with vengeance, and every cabinet member who signed becomes a target. Careers end. Security becomes a concern. The party fractures. This is why Section 4 has remained largely theoretical. It requires not only legal authority, but coordinated bravery, and bravery is rare when the consequences are personal and immediate. In this telling, the Vice President is not only weighing the Constitution, he is weighing civil stability because a substantial faction of the country could interpret Section 4 not as protection, but as an illegitimate coup. And that interpretation, whether true or not, would have real-world effects. Protests, unrest, threats, and a government trying to function under a cloud of contested legitimacy. The cabinet as three factions in your narrative. The cabinet splits into three practical groups. That's a useful way to understand how these situations unfold. The loyalists, true believers, or career survivalists who interpret chaos as strategy and interpret any challenge as betrayal. They will not sign, no matter what. They are not persuadable. Their role is to block. The institutionalists, people who care about continuity, security, and the functioning of the state. They may be alarmed, they may be willing, but they fear standing alone. The opportunists/strategists, the group that watches the wind. They are not driven by ideology so much as by outcomes. They will sign if they believe the move is already winning. They won't if they think it will fail. The critical point is that Section 4 requires a majority, not anonymity, but it requires enough to create a shield. Enough people acting together that the retaliation cannot be surgically precise. Collective action is what makes the mechanism viable. Isolation is what makes it impossible. The medical conversation without diagnosis. There is an ethical wall in public life when it comes to mental health. Professionals are discouraged from diagnosing people they haven't examined. And for good reason. Diagnosis from distance can become a weapon. But incapacity under Section 4 is not technically a medical diagnosis. It is a judgment of functioning. The amendment does not require a doctor's letter. It requires the Vice President and Cabinet to state in writing that the President cannot perform the duties. That reality produces a strange public space where people can't ethically declare a condition. But they can still point to behavior patterns and ask whether the person is functioning. In this telling, the evidence is behavioral. Disorganized communication, contradictory claims, erratic sleep cycles, confusion about reality, and the increasing frequency of episodes. The argument becomes less, what is wrong with him, and more, can he do the job safely? It's a grim question because it strips away politics and lands in the realm of human limitation. Why social media makes this unprecedented history includes presidents who were ill while in office, strokes, chronic disease, cognitive decline. What history didn't include was real-time broadcasting of deterioration. In earlier eras, the public didn't see the private patterns. Aides managed appearances. Institutions protected the image. The president's decline could be concealed for long stretches. In the modern era, a president with a phone can expose the country to his internal state minute by minute without gatekeepers. That is a new vulnerability in the system. It turns mental stability into a national security issue that unfolds publicly, not behind closed doors. And it accelerates panic because there is no longer a buffer between the president's impulses and the public record. The choice in front of the system. If this narrative were true, the system would be boxed in by two risks. If the cabinet and vice president act, they may prevent a catastrophic decision, but ignite a political explosion and claims of illegitimacy. If they do not act, they avoid immediate political rupture, but gamble that instability does not become an irreversible crisis. And the harsh truth is that both choices can cause damage. The difference is which kind of damage and whether it's survivable. That is why in this telling, Washington doesn't sleep after a night like this. People start counting who would sign, who wouldn't, how many are needed, what's the timeline, what happens if the president contests, do they have the votes in Congress? Because once a Section 4 conversation begins, it becomes a math problem with constitutional stakes. What happens next in this scenario? In the hours after a night like this, the public may see very little. That's another reason these stories feel unreal. The most important activity happens quietly. Closed-door meetings, legal memos, cabinet calls, contingency planning with security services, discussions of procedure, who drafts the declaration, how it's transmitted, what happens minute by minute afterward. And there will likely be messaging preparation on all sides, because the first statement after a Section 4 move would define the narrative. Protection or coup, stability or betrayal. The moment also forces the party in power to choose whether it is loyal to a person or loyal to an institution. That's not a philosophical choice in this context. It is a practical one because institutions can survive a leader. They may not survive repeated emergencies. Closing. If the country ever reaches a point where Section 4 is seriously considered, the most revealing fact won't be a viral clip. It will be whether the vice president and a majority of the cabinet are willing to sign their names to the sentence that ends normal politics. The president is unable. And if they do, the United States enters a constitutional corridor with no comforting precedent, one that moves fast, splits alliances, and forces Congress to make a decision under extraordinary pressure. If they don't, then the nation simply waits for the next night and the next, hoping the moment never arrives when a late-night spiral turns into a command that cannot be taken back. Either way, the lights stay on, the phones keep ringing, and everyone in the system understands the same thing. The guardrails only work if someone is willing to touch